Habakkuk chapter 1, and I'm going to go through the whole chapter here with you today. So as you find your way there, I have a question for you. Have you ever had a problem you just could not solve? Too difficult for you to solve. This happens to all of us. You know, there's a movie a while back where a writer, the main character of the movie, got to ask the Lord interview questions about anything that he wanted to. I think they had 3 meetings, and I think it was called An Interview with God or something like that. He would ask God these questions, the character who was playing God, but he didn't like any of the answers that he got from the Lord. Even though in this movie, the Lord was trying to help him with a problem that he couldn't solve. He didn't even know he had this problem. And it's weird because we have things like that in our life, these big issues, problems that come up from time to time, and then we struggle with just leaving it with God. And the same thing is going on here in this chapter. Habakkuk has a problem that he can't solve. And most of this that we're going to look at here, in fact, the whole book, these 3 chapters, is a conversation between him and God. And then we get to just look over their shoulder at it. I call this message, God Knows What He's Doing. God knows what He's doing. We're going to realize that here. I mean, I hope you already know that. We're going to be reminded of that here today, that God knows what He's doing. And so we can just leave the problem with Him, because He will be the one who will help us resolve that and show us what we should do. Because this particular chapter deals with something that we all face at one time or another. I keep crying out about something, but God doesn't seem to be doing anything. And so the main point that he establishes a little bit later on is that we have to have faith even when it doesn't make sense. God knows what He's doing. Habakkuk, he lived at a time where he was worried because he saw the wickedness in his country all around him, and he didn't know what to do. And so what he did was what all people should do when they have a problem that they can't answer, is he took his difficulties to God, and then he got his direction from Him. And he works out his whole problem with the Lord for all of us to see here. And it's a great help for us today. It's very applicable for us. And that's really the theme of this short book. So here in chapter 1, what we're going to do is look at the conversation between this prophet and God, and it's in 3 parts. It begins with what I call the complaint. The prophet has a complaint, and then we'll see the response in part 2 that God gives him, and then in part 3, he's going to come back with a critique on God's response. So hopefully we're going to be encouraged as when we leave here today, that more so than when we got here, that we would agree that God knows what He's doing, because He does. And we should leave the problem with Him. Part 1, here is the complaint, and the general complaint here from the prophet is, you gotta do something, okay? That's the complaint. So let's begin here in verse 1, and here's what it says. The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. Habakkuk lived in Jerusalem, as far as we can tell, around the 6th century BC. There's not a lot we know about him, basically what we find out in this book. But at that time, it was after the Assyrians had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel was a divided kingdom after the time of David and Solomon. They became the northern tribes and the southern tribes, or Judah, down in the south. And so the Assyrians had conquered northern Israel, and Judah, the southern kingdom, they were a little more faithful to God in who they were, but they didn't learn from the mistakes of the northern tribes. And so God was about to use the Babylonians to do the same to them, which what happened to the northern tribes. You see, Israel had turned their back on God, and they essentially became a secular society. And so this punishment is going to come. But before the punishment comes, this prophet, Habakkuk, began receiving a burden, as we see there in verse 1, or a heavy weight of what the problems were. He saw what the issue was. And then we're going to see how God was going to deal with it. I wanted to show you, this is just a simple timeline of the prophets, and I know there's a lot going on here, but I think it's helpful to have a visual, because if you can see on the screen, the prophets on the left side, the group on the left side, at the top says Assyrian Empire, and then there were the kings of the northern tribes, like Jeroboam and so forth. And then at the bottom is the years, and then above that is the southern kings like Uzziah and Manasseh and so forth. Well, in between those, grouped in the left side, would be, it's mostly the prophets that spoke first, because they were the ones who were speaking primarily to the northern tribes of Israel, right? Because they were in more trouble or earlier than the southern tribes were. So then in the center, you see the prophets grouped together that were more geared towards the southern tribes. And the red arrow there points to Habakkuk. He was a prophet, as far as we can tell, during the end of the reign of King Josiah, who was a good king and had a lot of reforms in Israel. But then at the end of his time came bad kings after him. And it's really what propelled the southern kingdom to end up in the 70-year exile in Babylon, right? So I just kind of wanted you to see that, get a visual of that. Now, if you're a little bit older, like me, you're kind of in a similar place that this prophet was, because he saw a revival through King Josiah and then a spiritual decline at the time of the kings after. Just like, if you're old enough, there was a spiritual revival in our country in the 60s and the 70s, the Jesus Revolution, and thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds or millions came to Christ during that time, and it really changed our country for the better in that time. But then, as time's gone on, you could say we're in a free fall of moral decline today. So there's some similarities, if you've been around for a while, between then and now, just like he's experiencing. So all that to say, he has this heavy weight that's upon him about this. So let's see what happens. It says in verse 2, so he says, O Lord, because of this heavy weight, O Lord, how long shall I cry and you will not hear? Even cry out to you, violence, and you will not save. So he saw a big problem in his country, and he's wondering why God wasn't doing anything about it. It's interesting. God gave him the burden, and then he doesn't think God's doing anything about it. That's how we are sometimes. He says, how long should I complain about this when you aren't even listening, Lord? Look at all the violence. Aren't you going to stop it? How long is this going to last? G. Campbell Morgan, in his commentary on this, he said, this is actually a problem that's created by faith. And it's true if you think about it, because here is a guy who has faith in the Lord, and then because of that faith in the Lord, he's like, how long should I cry out to God that I put my faith in? Because I trust in him, but it doesn't look like anything's happening. So what I'd like to do here, and this is in the app if you have that, I'm going to give you some complaints here that Habakkuk is going to lay at the feet of the Lord, just kind of one by one. So if you want to jot those down or just commit them to memory. Here's the first complaint that we see, and that is he said that God won't save them from violence. God won't save us from violence. He doesn't think the Lord's doing anything. He's not saving his nation from violence. It's interesting to me that people want free will, but then we get upset with what happens as a result of having free will. We're all like shocked when people go nutty because God lets us choose what we're going to do with our life. And then we start asking, why do you let this happen, God? Well, you can't have it both ways. Either we're free or we're not. And since we are, at least I believe we are, the bad comes along with it, doesn't it? Sometimes. And that's what's happening here. God doesn't make them obey him. So God won't save us from violence. Well, he goes on with another complaint in verse 3 and says, why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. The second complaint that he has here in this first part is there's trouble everywhere he looks. There's trouble everywhere he looks. His second complaint here is there's trouble everywhere he looks. He says, I'd rather not know. I can't fix it. He feels hopeless. He says, Lord, why are you showing me these things? Why have you given me this weight? All this trouble everywhere I look. His response can be like a response that believers today have when we see trouble everywhere we look. Probably several ways that we could respond to trouble everywhere we look, but here's a couple of them. A, you could become indifferent to all of it. There's just so much of it. You just there's nothing you can do. You just throw up your hands and then have like a lack of heart for the problems that are around us. That's one way to respond when there's trouble all around. Or B, we can become overwhelmed and negative about it all, sort of like what he's doing. So there's the no heart or the lose heart people. And neither of those are the desire of God. So he's struggling with this clearly. He's got all these complaints. To him, God seems silent about the evil that's going on. So he goes on in verse 4 and he says, therefore the law is powerless and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. Okay, he's got one more complaint here, and that's that there's no justice. There's no justice. And it seems like that's one of the complaints that we're seeing in some of the U.S. cities right now. You know what I'm talking about? Like rioting and looting and innocent people being beaten for just going about their business. And it seems like, at least when you watch the video, that nothing's really being done about it. There's no justice, right? I hear people are yelling. It seems like the evil ones are the ones that are in control here. Where's the justice, right? This isn't just something that happened way back then. It happens now. A lot of this sounds like today, doesn't it? People start to say, man, the enemy is winning. And so sometimes a response to that is, well, see, there is no God. Because if there were, he would do something about it, wouldn't he? You could say his general complaint is that the Lord doesn't seem to care. And this may be the most common complaint when it comes to God. Why are the people suffering, and why aren't you doing anything about it? It's on the mind of believers and non-believers alike. If God is real and he's good, then he's got to make this stop, right? So that's his complaint. Why aren't you doing something, Lord? So now God gets to respond to him. He's put it out there. And part 2 that we come to now is the response. The response. And basically God's response is, I am doing something. Okay, so let's look at this together, verses 5 and 6. He says, look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded. For I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. God responds, and it's as if he says, oh, it's way worse than you think it is. I'm going to use an evil nation to chasten Israel. Gulp. So just like I did with the complaints, I'm going to show you sort of sub-responses here to kind of latch on to things. And the first response that we see from God is that he does not overlook sin. And aren't you glad about that? He knows the issue. He's not overlooking sin. The prophet thought he was. But he's not. And he just told us. He says, here's my plan. I'm going to use the Chaldeans to discipline Israel. Chaldeans is another name for Babylonians, right? It's just another way to refer to it. And so those were the people that were going to come. At this time, that they weren't a world power like they would become later on. And so the Lord is describing what they're going to do in the future. He says, look, they're going to come and they're going to take the promised land away from the Jews. And then we know later on that they go in exile for 70 years because of their rebellion against the Lord. And this is his response to sin in the land. But to answer the prophet's question, he says, I am doing something, but you're going to have a hard time accepting it. So the second response that we see that the God gives of these part is he says, I am doing a work. His second response is, I am doing a work. And it was right there in verse 5. Just like today, we may see that things look a little hopeless on the surface, but he's doing a work today. God is not silent. Francis Schaeffer wrote a book once and it said, God is there and he is not silent. That was the title of the book. And it's true. He is there and he's not silent. He cares. He says, look, Habakkuk, you just don't know how to recognize what I'm doing yet, but you will. I feel your pain. I'm the one who gave you the burden in the first place, and I'm here. I'm going to do something. I am doing something. He continues, the Lord does in verses 7 and 8, he says, they are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. He's describing the Chaldeans. Their horses also are swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. He says, you think it's bad now? Just wait till they show up. They're terrible and dreadful. How about that? Double whammy. Basically, he means that they're a fearful people. They have lots of strength. They're very prideful. It's like nobody is going to stand in their way. So just get ready because they're coming. He said they all come for violence in verse 9. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds to seize it. In that day, most cities were walled cities. So in order to conquer those cities that had walls for defense, the enemy would build siege mounds against them. And they would push dirt, piles and piles and piles of dirt up against the wall to make a ramp, right? So they could get up and over it and get in that city to conquer it and fight and so forth. And so, the Lord tells us that because that's what they do. And he says, not only will nobody stand in their way, but nothing is going to stop them either. They're bad dudes. They want violence, he said. They take people captive. Just as a side note, these are qualities of the devil, that he wants people to suffer. So he causes folks to rage and injure one another. And you know what? God will allow it if that's what people want. But he's still doing a work. There is a solution if people will turn to God. There really is. Well, lastly, the Lord says in verse 11 in his response, he says, then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. Okay, so they do all this evil that he's predicting, and then they will say, we were able to do it because the power of our gods. And of course, the Lord takes offense at that too. Not only the wicked deeds, but then worshiping false gods to say that they are the ones who gave me the ability to do it. So, in a nutshell, he's going to use these people to punish Israel, but then later, he's going to deal with Babylon too because of it. He says essentially to Habakkuk, look, don't worry. I know these guys are guilty of these things. I'm going to take care of it. Okay, so to wrap up the Lord section here, let me ask you a question. So if you were the prophet, would you feel satisfied with God's response? Do you feel like God has answered his questions? Do you think he is? Well, let's find out. So part 3, and this will be the last part that we cover here today. Part 3, I call the critique, okay? In other words, the prophet's going to say, well, don't do it like that. This is his critique, okay? And see if you see any similarities with us today when we go through this. Verse 12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. We're going to see here in the next few verses, he's like, wait, what? This is worse than the original problem. You're holy. Why would you do that? Do you remember what his first problem was? Why aren't you doing anything? Now what's the problem? Why are you doing it like that? Anybody ever said that to God? I have. This is how people usually respond to God's answers. First of all, we wonder, why doesn't he do something? And then it's followed with, well, I wouldn't do it like that if I were God. But you know what? I really like him because he still does a wise thing here. He remembers that God is everlasting and holy. He knows that Israel will not be completely cut off from God because they're the promised people. He made promises to them in the beginning. And so he's going to fulfill everything that he said. And he remembers those things, okay? He made promises and he's holy and good. And you know, this is a good thing for you and I to put into practice too. When big things that trouble you come your way, remember God's nature. Remember his promises. Remember that he's good. Remember that he's gracious. Remember that all things work together for good for those who love God and are the called according to his purposes. And he never changes the way he does that. He's always like that. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So we can trust that. You gotta remember that. So, you know, looking at this, we could say that Habakkuk has some confidence in the Lord. He just doesn't understand why he would do it like this. So he's critical. He realizes that the punishment for Israel is limited in its time and purposes, and it's going to be more harsh for Babylon in the end because of judgment, but he still doesn't like it. So look with me at verse 13. He said, you are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? I was reading this, I was reminded that God won't have fellowship with evil. That's why we need a Savior. The scriptures tell us that light has no fellowship with dark. The Son of God, the Son of Man, came to offer human beings a way out of darkness. And as we learned in Luke when we went through that, we heard it time and again that the Lord shed his blood on the cross to wash away sin for those who will believe. There is a way out of the dark. Faith in Jesus Christ. And maybe you're here today and you didn't think there was a way out of the darkness that you're experiencing or that you've put yourself in. But just know that there is. To say there isn't is a lie. And the Lord will freely give it to those who believe. So if you haven't done that yet, I'd urge you to put your trust in Jesus Christ, because he came for you as much as he came for anyone else. So he's talking about wickedness and darkness, but his focus here is on critique of God. That's what verse 13 is really about. And again, I want to point out 3 critiques in this last part of our study here today. His first critique that he makes in verse 13 is that this way is worse. This is worse, he says. How could God, who's just and good and hates evil, send against his people a nation who openly admits it makes its own gods? This is worse. I mean, how would you feel if God announced that he was going to discipline the United States with a country that was way worse off spiritually than we are? How would you feel? Probably like him. Well, that's what's happening. He agrees that Judah needs to be disciplined, but not by them. I was thinking, like, how could we apply this to something that could happen today? It would be like if, say, a Christian parent had a young adult son who walked away from the Lord. And so the parents began to pray for God to do something to turn him back. And so what the Lord does is allows an awful girlfriend into that young man's life to make it even more miserable for him than it was before. And this is just an example. Now, while all this was going on, what would those parents be thinking? This is worse than it was. Why is God allowing this? We asked him to help us. We asked him to turn our son back to Jesus. Well, that's what he's doing. Perhaps that young man gets to the end of himself quicker because the girl's a nightmare. He's like, this isn't what I signed up for. I'm going back to God. This is awful, or whatever the thing is. And it's just an example. But God does these things. Remember, there is no darkness in God. He is light, and there's no darkness at all. But he will let evil continue and actually use it for good sometimes to accomplish his purposes and plans, even though he's not the father of it. And this happens in all different kinds of ways, and it's kind of fascinating, and that's what's happening here with Israel. Well, verse 14, he continues with his critique, and he says, why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They take up all of them with a hook. They catch them in their net and gather them in their dragnet. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet, because by them their share is sumptuous and their food plentiful. Okay, the second critique that he makes here is that he's offended by this. He's offended by this. He says, look at them. They catch men in their nets and then they worship their nets. So he can't just wrap his mind around how God can use them. But you got to remember, you guys, when this kind of stuff happens, that his thoughts are not our thoughts. God's ways are not our ways. C.S. Lewis said once, he said, if the Bible is true, it has to be true across all ages. Therefore, it's going to offend everyone along the way. And it will, right? This guy is worried that they're going to get away with evil. And you know what? He's not the only one. A lot of people are worried about that. I came across one of the Psalms where Asaph was worried that wicked people were getting away with evil. And I want to show you a couple verses from Psalm 73. Look what he said. He says, but as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped, for I was envious of the boastful when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. See, he's just crying out because he was stumbled by the prosperity of evil people. He's kind of jealous that they're just do whatever they want and they're getting away with it. Look at them, living it up, getting away with it. Well, says who? Just because it appears that way doesn't mean that they are. If you continue to read that psalm, actually it's fascinating psalm to read if you haven't, or just maybe as a little homework assignment, you go read Psalm 73 later today. But later on, the Lord shows Asaph what the end looks like. He says, when I went into your sanctuary, when I drew near you, I saw the end, and it became clear to me that it doesn't end well if you're in rebellion against God. Evil is actually a self-destructive thing. And so we really need a savior, because we will just destroy ourselves in it eventually. And you know what? Despite all that, I believe that God ultimately loves the Babylonians too. He proved it in the scriptures when, even though it's a different group of people, Jonah, the prophet Jonah, was sent to reach the people of Nineveh, who were the Assyrians, and they were worse than the Babylonians. And God wanted to reach them because he loved them. And Jesus came for all of us. Even though these people, he said there in what we read, they catch people to control them and enslave them and then kill them. Well, God's greater than that. He catches people to give them eternal life and give us hope and freedom and a future. He's always out to show sinners some grace so they can turn to God and be saved. And they don't realize that yet, but hopefully they will. Well, let's finish here in verse 17 and we'll close. It says, shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? We're going through his critique of the Lord's response. And the third critique was they never pay. That was a concern of his. They never pay. Are you going to let them do this and just enjoy it? Never pay for it? But I just want to remind you, friend, that God knows what he's doing. They will pay one way or another, either by the blood of Jesus or their own self at the judgment seat of God. Everybody pays. Well, since we're going to leave off here, you're kind of left hanging. It's sort of a negative way to end a Bible study. So what I would like you to do is to read ahead to chapter 2, because in it we get hope to the concern that the prophet has. And here's a hint for you. It has to do with faith in God's plan and purposes. But I'm going to give you just a little sneak peek to send you on your way. And it's in the very next verse there in chapter 2, verse 1. And I'm just going to read it to you. Look what is said by the prophet. He says, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. That's so great. In other words, despite all the things that he said, the critique and everything, and he says, I'm going to watch and see. I'm willing to be corrected. I have an expectation to hear from the Lord on these things. And what a blessing that is, because he does receive that. And he ends up worshiping God at the end of this book. So we'll just continue on this journey through it together. And I just want to do a quick review here with you. The main thing we can learn from chapter 1, I think, is to leave the problem with God. Habakkuk doesn't understand the specifics, but he's content to leave it with God. And you know what? I think that's a sign of maturity. To wait patiently for an answer and to trust that he's going to follow through, because he always does. Maybe you have a question or a problem that you can't resolve. Well, I hope you've been encouraged to take it to the Lord. Take it to him. But just remember, when you do, his ways are not our ways. There will be an answer. There is a solution, but you may not understand that, and you may not agree with it. So in the meantime, remember, church, God knows what he's doing. Amen.